Hello and welcome to Deprogram. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at the lotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Charlie Downs from the Centre for Migration Control. Now, of course, Charlie, thank you very much for coming on again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We had you on fairly recently, but Reform UK are in the news. They had their annual conference last year, the first such event since the general election, and you were there. Connor was there as well. I was in Dublin, but never mind. One of the things that Reform UK likes to trumpet, and it is true in large part, is the way in which they are making inroads into the youth vote in ways that the Tories have historically failed to do. This is a phenomenon that exists on the continent as well. In the recent regional elections in Brandenburg in Germany, Olaf Scholz's Social Democrat Party did actually top the polls, but crucially, the AfD won most of the vote with the 18 to 29-year-old cohort, which is very rare. It's not something that we would have expected 10 years or so ago. Do you think that Reform are making the most of their youth support and doing the most that they could be to consolidate it?
Well, last time I was on the show, I obviously spoke about the campaign that myself and a handful of others were running to push Reform to establish an official youth wing, because I think any self-respecting, serious party wants to tap into, engage and harness the kind of youthful energy, if it exists, around them. And Reform really does have that. 1 in 10 under 30s voted for Reform at the general election. And at the conference, there was a noticeable number of young faces there, which was very encouraging to see. At this stage, I feel Reform are essentially consolidating. This conference was very much a celebration. That was the kind of atmosphere that it had of their success at the general election. And whilst there were a few conversations about political strategy going forward, more than anything, it was what Nigel called a big rah-rah.
Nothing necessarily wrong with that.
No, indeed, not at this stage. I've had a number of conversations with the leadership of the party about establishing a youth wing, and those talks are ongoing. But I think for the time being, the party is very much focused on rolling out their national structure, their infrastructure, for actually campaigning on the ground for local elections and, of course, the next general election. And their strategy on that front seems pretty sound. I'm involved in my local branch. I'm seeing how I can help out there, if possible. And, all of that, their head is in the right place in that regard. Now, in terms of harnessing that youthful energy that I mentioned, this conference very much did have the feel in the rhetoric that was used of appealing to their main voting demographic, which is over 50s, essentially. Now, a place where Reform need to really put some thought is their messaging when it comes to British values, right? Because this is a phrase that is used by basically all of the party's leadership on a fairly regular basis in public settings. And this is a phrase that, in my mind, very much belongs to the kind of noughties, early 2010s New Labour regime. This was a creation of Blair, essentially, an attempt to crystallise what the United Kingdom and Britain is into a set of abstract values that really what they are in reality is the mores of that particular time. These are things like inclusion, diversity, equality, justice, and so on, all of these sorts of things. And so to use that kind of language as a dissident party, as an insurgent party, I think is the wrong framing, because you are using the language of your enemies, ultimately. What I would like to see Reform do is move beyond this language of values and into the language of identity, because, this idea of British values, Britain is a country that has values, but those values don't exist in the abstract. They exist as a result of thousands of years of tradition and history and people, most importantly. And without British people, you don't have British values. And that's a conversation that Reform has yet to have.
It's also worth saying it's not only that values are the product of a given people. People can embrace different values from one time to another.
Quite right.
And there can be moments when you might have two particular national identities existing at the same time alongside one another. And if they're both liberal, roughly speaking, liberal, democratic, post-1991, advanced capitalist economies, their values are going to be pretty similar, just in spite of those cultural particularities. I mean, often when someone like David Cameron will wheel out here are the 8 bullet points, because David Cameron was a sucker for this game as well.
Oh, yes.
Here are the 8 bullet points that make you British. Those 8 bullet points might as easily, in so many cases, describe Finland or Switzerland or some other liberal democratic country. There's nothing particularly British about it. There is not that conservative embrace of particularities, just an exclusively liberal focus on what's supposedly universal about advanced countries, which we and the second thing as well is that those values might be more admirable or less admirable. So there are times in history, and this is an example that I really like to use because I think it's particularly instructive. If you were to say that British values are, and David Cameron would do this, he would say things like it's about believing in democracy and about believing in tolerance, and it's about believing in gay marriage. Like, let's say that you said that those were 3 core British values. You could technically have and this is another example, like you could have a Yoruba Nigerian who probably living in Lagos rather than in the provincial parts of Nigeria where they're much more conservative, who could in principle agree with every single one of those propositions despite never ever having set foot in the British Isles. And meanwhile, someone like Lord Bolingbroke, who was a key figure in the 18th century, didn't particularly believe in democracy, was not that mad on tolerance, and probably didn't even envision that there might ever be a time where Britain would be passing laws to do with gay marriage at all. So these do not do justice to the continuity that a nation exhibits over time. There needs to be a people embracing this value at one moment. And you can say that those values are less good or more good. You can say that I prefer the values of 21st century Britain to the values of 18th century Britain. But there still needs to be that focal point of continuity that makes it Britain that's embracing new values rather than anywhere embracing new values. And that it's just completely lost. And you're right, it has to do with this civic nationalist conflation of identity with values.
Yeah, the thing that makes Britain great, and any great nation great, actually, is the people. It's not the values. The values are downstream from the people. And, what's made Britain great throughout its history is not its values. The values are something that you can ascertain after the fact. It's been the quality of the people. And this is not something that is reducible to a kind of rationalist series of propositions about these people. These people just acted and built the country that we live in today. Yes. And it's those people and their spirit that makes this country great, not the values.
It would also, I will let Connor come in, but it's just one thought that's occurred to me. It would also make civil wars impossible.
Yes.
Because how can a nation be going to war over its own? Like, it's not a nation going to war over its own values anymore. Like when you've got Charles I on one side and Oliver Cromwell on the other, that's a pretty significant gulf in values. It's one that led to the king losing his head in the end, but it was still the English Civil War, or if you want to call it the Civil Wars of the British Isles, if you want to call it that. This difference of values took place within a nation, within a people, and that can't exist if the people are equivalent with their values. Connor, what do you think either of this question or of what reform could be doing slightly better to tap into youth support?
Well, being there, I could tell that the reason they're emphasising British values so much is because of all of the slanderous accusations of racism, bigotry, etc. that were thrown at them, not just in the UKIP and Brexit Party days, but in the recent general election campaign. And I think Nigel is himself quite anxious about this because after his speech, they put out a clip saying, we, in the MLK fashion, only want to judge people on the content of their character, not the colour of their skin and their sexual orientation. It's not that any of us disagree with that, but it's that if you are making that your core message, you're in a permanent defensive posture against the media class who will always sling the insults that way, your way, because they would sooner see you dead than win an election. So you're not providing a positive vision as to why people should vote for you. Bear in mind, there are 4.8 million SOFA voters, mainly northern, non-university educated, living in Labour heartlands where reform often came second, who want a reason to vote for you distinct from the Uniparty. And that message of we're liberal, we're tolerant, Azir Youssef said British values are equality before the law and freedom of religion. Not specifically the religion that's been here, but obviously because as a Muslim he would like to shelter under the umbrella of liberalism. People in northern working class heartlands don't resonate with those platitudes. They resonate with concrete policies and they resonate with a sense of identity. That's why I think actually Robert Jemrick has wised up to this. And even though he couldn't articulate a thick, concrete conception of English identity, he said the English identity is under attack, not necessarily British values. And I think the reason this British values is being put forward is because they don't want to be seen to have a non-consensual, non-opt-in version of the national project,
Yes.
which would then invite comparisons, however undue, to hard-boiled Nazi racism, which Reform are definitely not.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points to make here. The first is I completely agree with you on Reform's fear of being called racist. It's very clear that their public-facing element is deathly afraid of that accusation. And perhaps they're right to be so, because this is an accusation that Farage has had pretty much for his entire career. I'm sure he's sick to death of it, and I'm sure he is taken probably quite a toll on him personally. So I don't blame them necessarily for thinking that way. But what I would say is, regardless of what you say, they're going to call you racist anyway, because that's how these people operate. Because for them, racist just means you don't buy into the ultra-liberal universal project.
You acknowledge cultural differences, therefore racist.
Yes, exactly. So what I would say to Reform, and actually to anybody who fears the accusation of racism if they're on the right, is the correct response to the accusation of racism is not, no, I'm not a racist. It's, okay, by leveling that word, using that word, leveling that accusation at me, what you have shown me is you belong to a political paradigm that is A, currently in power, therefore you are acting as its unwitting foot soldier, and B, nobody outside of SW1 regards it with any legitimacy. Because everyone in our generation who has any sense views the word racist as being almost completely meaningless. Because for our entire adult lives, everything has been racist. Milk has been racist. Windows have been racist. Kew Gardens have been racist. And so the correct response when some state-approved media outlet calls you racist is not, I promise I'm not, and here's my values, and here's my proof of that I'm not. It's, sorry, this has no legitimacy to me. This accusation that you're throwing at me means nothing to me, and it means nothing to any of my supporters, and it means nothing to anybody outside of your little bubble.
Yes, I mean, another concern as well. So we've been talking here about a certain softening of rhetoric that appears to have gone on. I mean, I have privileged access to a piece that Connor has written for, is it Ian Herseli's Substack? Or is it for us?
It is for Ian's Substack. It will be out by the time this episode is out.
Oh, so you can already go and read it then, which is very, very convenient. But document some of the ways in which this, for example, there's been a lot of talk about our mutual friend Stephen Edgington's very, very good and probing interview with Farage on GB News, in which I thought Farage did have some good moments, I must say. I thought his gloss on Enoch Powell's political career was very good and very measured and very even-handed, and he didn't engage in what has come to seem like a rather obligatory disavowal of Powell in a way that someone like Rees-Mogg does, and whenever he's asked about these sorts of questions. So yeah, I did think Farage had some good moments, particularly towards the end. But you've noticed a particular softening of rhetoric, Connor, and I think lots of people have, on the deportations point, particularly in light of what Reform wrote in their own contract with the People, their version of a manifesto, only 3 or so months ago. Yeah,
the specifics in the contract to the People were that Reform were going to deport every foreign criminal in Britain's prisons at the end of their term, and ensure that deportations were mandatory for every single crime except a small minority of non-violent crimes. I think it should just be
any crime.
All crimes, but there we go. It's a start. That means at least the 10,000 foreign criminals, which Richard Tice recently asked the Justice Minister, who has just let out a few thousand violent offenders early before the end of their sentence. Tice brought that up in Parliament and said, why are they still in the prisons if we're trying to make prison space? And she said, we will deport them. We know that won't happen because the Labour Party themselves, including Keir Starmer, 150 of them signed a letter to stop all those Jamaican criminals from being deported out of the country. One went on to go and commit murder. Anyway, point being, Reform said during the general election that they were going to deport all of those people. And then the general promise as well was that Channel boats will be intercepted and turned back to France, and they will use the power of the Royal Navy if necessary. And that is the kind of strength that nobody had seen, and it got people like my generally politically uninvolved parents who have just gone to the local high street and seen visually demographic change excited. So they decided to go and vote for Reform. And in the Edgington interview, when Stephen Edgington said, will you commit to mass deportations? Nigel Farage said, no, it's politically impossible. And he said it's logistically impossible because there are hundreds of thousands to millions of people here. Edgington was citing a Pew Research survey that said, because Blair abolished exit checks in 1998, by 2017, there were 1.2 million illegal visa overstays. Add another 130,000 small boats since 2018, and you've got 1.3 to 1.4 million. And Edgington said, okay, even if it's a political impossibility because as Farage said, this is the only thing people will talk about for 20 years if I commit to it. Is it at least your ambition to do this? And Nigel said no. And there was a very sharp intake of breath, particularly, I think, among young, very politically engaged men of all our ages, because what that was seen to be was a commitment not to uphold the law. Because the law is if you're an illegal immigrant, you get sent home. And it seems like at a time where the AFD are making ground, National Rally are making ground in France, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands,
Sweden Democrat, the coalition between the Sweden Democrats and the more centrist government, they're actively experimenting with remigration. This is 10 years ago. Bernie Sanders was pointing to Sweden as a model for kind of humanitarian, compassionate politics. Now they're openly experimenting with these sorts of things that wouldn't have been counseled 10 years ago. It goes to show how quickly public opinion can change.
Well, Trump also used the word remigration last week to describe his immigration policy of a promise of the largest deportation effort in American history. I mean, remember Eisenhower in the 50s, which Farage referenced. Yeah, sent back almost 1 million people.
Yeah.
Trump's going to do even more than that. It's no shock because under the Biden administration alone, 12 million illegal border crossings have happened. Trump estimates it's higher than about 20. But that means that if all these people are making political hay on the issue of mass deportations, why is Farage slowly backing off? Because I would wager that actually he would win a lot more support among the young men who he has as a potential voter bloc but hasn't necessarily convinced yet if he went for that.
This is crucial. Any right-wing party in Britain that wants to stand as a genuine opposition to the kind of governing regime that we've had for the better part of 30 years in this country must, as a statement of intent, commit to deporting every single illegal immigrant who currently resides in this country. As I read the same report that you just cited that said in 2017, maybe 2018, there were as many as 1.2 million illegal migrants settled in Britain. And half of those have been here for more than 5 years. Now, I don't care if they've been here for 50 years. I don't care if they have had children here. I don't care if they have a job here. If they're an illegal migrant, they have to be deported. And no party that, a party that does not commit to that cannot be regarded as truly being the opposition. Because what that means, regardless of whether you signal against illegal immigration, say that you're going to stop the boats and all the rest of it, if you are prepared to grant de facto amnesty to the millions of illegal migrants who currently reside here, then your words are empty. And only when either Reform or even the Conservative Party, as you said, you mentioned Jemrick already, who has, I've been actually quite impressed by his signalling recently.
He's a recent convert to the blindingly obvious, but
Indeed.
I'm glad that he made it there in the end.
Only when one of them commit to mass deportations, a robust program of remigration, will we actually have an opposition in this country.
And that's a very emphatic point of principle, and it's one that I know that both Connor and I agree with. But the other point to make here is that this is not like it's not as though this is a you win on conviction but you lose on pragmatism. You actually they're beautifully in harmony here.
Yes.
The other thing as well is that it doesn't take too much in the way of political courage, because as Connor and I have just been laying out, there are plenty of precedents both on the continent and in North America for this. It's not as though Farage is sort of ploughing this lone furrow, which does take political bravery, and political bravery is of course a virtue, but you need to pick and choose when you're going to exercise it. I think this would be predominantly a vote winner. It would get people off the sofa. Go on.
Well, on that point, me and Connor did a panel at the Reform Conference, which was nominally about digital campaigning. And
did you talk much about digital campaigning?
We did. No, we had it was an extremely enjoyable panel. We spoke a lot about the importance of social media and digital communications on politics in this day and age. And this is something that Reform have been very strong on. But in the Q&A section, inevitably, we got onto wider issues. And one of the questions that we were asked was, what is one area of messaging, one area of policy that you think Reform should either improve on or embrace or whatever? And there were 5 of us on the panel. Each of us said some variation of mass deportations. And the reaction of the crowd was, it told you all you needed to know. It was thunderous applause. Standing ovations from this crowd at the Reform Conference in the fringe event area, hundreds of people who gave us a thundering ovation for calling for mass deportation.
Mixed audience demographics.
I was about to ask that.
Yeah,
yes.
It skewed younger, obviously, because there are people that watch my show over on the Lotus Eaters. It was a young chap who had asked this question.
Yes,
he
it
said
was.
it in one sentence, just to keep it concise. And so I just said, mass deportations.
Yes.
Stopped. And you said, yes, a robust plan of remigration. And both of them were met with acclaim. And I think to use 2 brief examples on this from both the progressive left who are clearly just trying to use overtures to migration to make political hay. Olaf Scholz, which Farage himself referenced, is providing payments to Afghans to return home. We keep hearing, even from Farage in a recent September 10th immigration debate in Westminster, how we can't negotiate with the Taliban, so we need a third-party place to hold these migrants. Actually, lots of these so-called asylum seekers from Afghanistan are going back to Afghanistan on holiday. And so you can actually send them back there, and progressive parties are doing so. But also the other example is, as well, Donald Trump yesterday coming out and saying, if countries will not repatriate their criminal foreign expats, we will leverage sanctions, visa and economic relations on them to ensure that they do. And I think this is perfectly acceptable for developed economies, with Britain, hopefully with some economic reform, being a prosperous trading partner, to do this. It just requires political will.
Particularly when they're run by tin pot dictators as well, who will have wives who like doing things like going to Harrods in London. All you need to do is say, look, your wife is not going to be allowed into this country to do her quarterly perfume shopping in Harrods unless you exceeds to our demands. And it's exactly the blueprint of the reverse blueprint of what the Tories did, which was constantly signalling to people who were always going to hate their guts in any case, while failing to consolidate their own support. A lot of the people as well, and this is also something we've been talking about a lot, like most of the people whom reform need to mobilize, they're there for the taking on the messaging that they've already established in their contract for the people, and precisely the kind of messaging we're talking about here as well. You said it was mixed in terms of age profile when you got this round of applause. Of course, you had the young Zoomers on board. That's good. That gets you youth support. That gets you energy. The boomers are not in general completely turned off to this idea when they have it put to them as well. There are plenty of those people in the audience. Labour voters, particularly in those northern heartlands, which feel aggrieved after the Keir Starmer's tin-eared response to the Southport stabbings and the tarring everyone with the same overused far-right brush. The sofa voters that Connor's spoken about, like, this is there for the taking. It is pragmatically defensible.
Well, once again, it comes back down to this crippling fear that so many of our people have of being called names, being called racist, being called bigoted, anything else. I know people who work in the corporate world who are not particularly political. They're my friends and my family as well, who instinctively dislike the way this country is going, because how couldn't you? Look around. But they still remain deathly afraid of being called racist, because something I think is easy to forget, especially for us who work in the kind of, we have the privilege of being able to speak our minds because of the line of work that we've chosen to go into and managed to build a life, in.
Well, there's certainly no going back now.
There certainly isn't, no, especially not after just calling for mass deportations. But hey, quite swings and roundabouts. Anyway, these people who still work in the corporate world, who are answerable to HR managers, they remain deathly afraid of being called racist, because they are still to this day getting unconscious bias training and diversity, equity, and inclusion away days and courses and all this sort of thing. So it's no surprise that people remain so deathly afraid of this kind of labelling, which is why a party like Reform is so well positioned to normalise this kind of language, because this is not some crackpot nothing party that has no elected representatives. This is a mainstream political party that everybody knows, with 5 MPs in Parliament. This is not something you can just take down with a media hit piece. This is something that has a foothold in power. It has actual power, and that's not something we've had for a long time in Britain. A meaningful right-wing alternative having real power. And so Reform should assess that situation. They should recognise the position of advantage that they're in. And they should understand that those accusations of racism are going to come no matter what. But actually their role, their duty to the British people is to be the voice of those people who feel they have no voice, who feel that they themselves can't speak out for fear of social or professional reprisals. Again, I recognise that Reform is a young party. Reform is a party that's still very much finding its feet, very much building its national infrastructure. And I respect their strategy of taking things one step at a time, because I think you want to do things right. You don't want this phenomenon to just collapse in the next 5 years. Reform wants to replace the Tory party. Reform want to be a party with some staying power. With that being said, though, I think that sooner rather than later, there needs to be a conversation within the leadership about really how they're going to proceed on their messaging and the extent to which they're going to give credence to the accusations that the media are always going to level at them. Because the answer to that question should be we're going to give it none. You know, we don't care about what you think of us. We don't care what you call us because we have the will of the people on our side.
If I may advise them to set themselves one rule, it's a rule that I've been keeping for myself for some time. If Douglas Murray is saying it's stronger, you're losing. Because Douglas Murray acts as a rhetorical minesweeper. He always cites his sources and always says it very concisely. And he has become a thought leader, not just around the world, but particularly even for the Tory party, who are very squeamish, even more so than Reform, on these issues of identity, Islam and immigration.
Elside Murray.
Yes. So,
sorry, could I just interrupt? Nadeem Zahawi, who's not a kind of fire-breathing dissident right-wing radical, was citing Murray approvingly in the Times the other day. I think a rhetorical minesweeper. It's a brilliant way of putting it.
Yeah, and so if Murray is saying things that you think are going to be on the pale if you can say them, clearly they're not. So I think that what the message hopefully Reform can take away from what we're saying here or elsewhere is that there's a lot more room to manoeuvre, and taking up all that space actually wins you voters.
Yes. Go on.
I was just going to say on this topic, something else that Reform really should be wary of is the fact that, you know, I'm close to certain people who are working on the Generic campaign, the Generic leadership campaign. And I know that there are a number of people who we know, who we would regard as being sound, who are advising them. And so Reform, you know, Generic in particular is hot on the heels of Farage. Now, you can say that he's copying his messaging, and I think there is certainly some truth to that. But what that team has recognised is that the mood of the country is very much towards a far more muscular position when it comes to things like national identity. And they have, you know, to that end, they have brought in people who, even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, the Tory party would not have allowed anywhere near.
Yes.
And so all the while Reform, again, are fearful of what they might be called, the Tory party is making gains. And whether or not you view that as a good thing or a bad thing or whatever, it's just a fact that Reform need to have a reason to exist.
Yes.
Right? And if it's not the defence of British national identity, not values, identity, British people, and deportation of criminals, then I don't know what it is.
I think there's also an anxiety, and I completely agree with you, and I will just say very quickly about the Generic stuff, that I used to be of the view that we want someone like Tom Tugendhat to win the Tory party election, because then Reform will better be able to position itself as the real alternative in British politics. I'm now of the view, which is sort of fed by what you were just saying, that it would actually be much better if Generic wins, because if Generic wins, what you might get is a very kind of a mutually reinforcing
arms race
yes. going on. Where Farage will feel the need to outbid Generic from the right, Generic will feel the need to outbid Farage from the right. When I say the right, I just mean I mean kind of the rough formula of the left, slightly more left on economics, not full on planned economy, but slightly more left on economics and right on culture, and you will get that sort of very virtuous, don't want to say purity spiral, but you get the point, underway. So hopefully we'll have to watch that space. I think another concern that animates Reform, it's not just the fear of being accused being racist. I think it's also it is a genuinely commendable in some ways desire to seem inclusive. Again, I don't think the practicalities of this and the principles of this are as in conflict as they seem to think. I mean, for one thing, if you look at the breakdown in polling among different communities in Britain, Reform with the ethnic minority vote, it is lower than the African American vote for Republicans. It's absolutely tiny.
7%.
7%. It's vanishingly small. Now, should you be going out of your way to alienate and upset and offend and castigate those people? Obviously not. But nor should you be going out of your way to pander to them either, because that is just not practically sensible. And it also means that you're politically neutering yourself on what should be your main point, which is defending the national identity of the host population rather than pandering to these sort of tribal political subcultures which exist in Britain. And the last thing I'll say as well is that I would be in favour of grouping minorities in this country into three rough groups. You get minorities who are overtly hostile to our interests. These people are more mainstream than we would like to think.
Hamza Yusuf,
Sadiq Khan is one. You get minorities who are indifferent to our interests. Sajid Javid saying "so what" when Nigel Farage, weirdly, in 2021, despite somewhat backtracking since, and Connor also mentions this in his piece, completely forgot about this, when Farage in 2021, after the census came out, was saying, gosh, there are now 3 cities in the UK which are minority native, majority minority. Sajid Javid commenting, "so what?" That is indifference. Sajid Javid is a minority, sure, he's a nice man, but that is indifference to the host population. So that's the second category. And then you get what Eric Kaufman calls cultural traditionalist minorities. And these are minorities who genuinely love their host nation. I mean, we know some. Momus, I don't know if we all know Momus Najmi. He's been on the show before.
Ben Habib is
an example of one.
Half ancestry.
Yeah,
but a perfect example of this.
And so just to define ethno-cultural traditionalist, it is someone who genuinely loves their host nation, but doesn't love it because they associate it with a David Cameron-style laundry list of abstract values. They associate what is good about Britain with its historic people.
Yes.
And they take the same attitude to demographic change in Britain that I would take if my heart ever moved me to go and live in Tokyo. I would want to see the Japanese people preserved despite not being one myself. If I was living in Japan, learnt the language, and absorbed much of Japanese culture, I wouldn't pretend to be Japanese, and I wouldn't engage in that sort of identity theft, and I wouldn't agitate against their interests. Certainly wouldn't agitate against their interests, but nor would I show a kind of blithe indifference to their interests. If you group them into those 3 broad categories of minority, all reform needs to do, given that they are only on 7% with these minorities anyway, is consolidate that support among those ethno-cultural traditionalist minorities. They do exist. They're slightly rarer than we'd like to think. They do exist. That's all you need to do. And you don't need to do any pandering. And if you really need to deflect accusations of racism, mention that. But make sure that you're doing it on your terms, not on the terms of your adversaries.
Yeah, well, that 7% figure is interesting because my guess nationally would be that those people who occupy that third category would make up something like between 5 and 10% of the immigrant population.
Yes.
So 7%, that
checks out.
That checks out, yeah.
Yes.
Now, this is just a good point on political strategy in general, beyond reform, that actually the left understand very well. You don't see the Democrats appealing to the evangelical Christians in America, or gun owners, although Kamala Harris has attempted to do that, interestingly. Bad political strategy. Anyway, they recognize that they have their constituency and they seek to consolidate and expand, actually, that. And if, again, reform, if they want to capture a larger voter base, which is ultimately what they should be seeking to do as a party that's seeking to be a party of government in 5 years' time, they will recognise the fact that their voter base is the native British and that they should seek to be a party that represents the interests of the native British. And those, again, are not British values. They are British identity, ultimately, which comes out of history, tradition, and people. God, there's so much to say on reform. I don't think we'll have time to say it all today. But I have the faith that they will be an effective vehicle for genuinely dissident politics to enter the halls of power in Britain. But again, they have a long road ahead of them.
If I may make one observation that is terminally Zoomer, I think you'll agree with me on this.
Yep. Speaking my language now.
There is a clear generational divide, both with the messaging and the, vibe of the conference. I would estimate about 20% of the attendees were our age.
Yeah, I'd say.
The rest of them were 40 to 70.
Yeah.
Right. And Farage has got that block consolidated. As I joked to you when we were there, it felt a bit like someone trying to incite a Trump rally during bingo night at Butlins.
Yes.
And there is a wholesomeness about that.
Yeah,
again,
bless them, yeah.
As the son of a plumber and a teacher, when we didn't have much money to go abroad, we would go on caravan holidays, and I'd get stuck there as there was some really cheesy music because I got my head buried in a book or something at the clubhouse. However, that kind of aesthetic, while it may consolidate the existing over 50 working class white British patriots who will take a day off work and come down and spend it in Birmingham to sing Sweet Caroline and I Love You Baby, it doesn't necessarily attract us. Yeah. What did attract us, young men like us, were the TikToks that Farage was producing. It was evident when Aaron Bastani just went to a random rural town in the southwest and 2 young lads on their bikes said, "We're voting reform because too many foreigners, it's turned to hell round here." And it's clear that they've just observed demographic change, looked online for some answers, found Farage, gone for reform. So my question would be to you, this is something we spoke about at our panel. What should Reform's engagement strategy be with, I don't know, online podcasts, dissident magazines, just new types of media and messaging to attract more guys in our bracket?
Well, this is interesting because, the AFD and the National Rally have come up already today. And if you look, I follow both of those parties quite closely because I think they are shining examples of what a well-run dissident right-wing party that has actual electoral potential can look like, right? And these are parties that are very clearly run, at least in their marketing and messaging departments, by young people. There is a vitality and an energy about them that the other sort of mainstream regime parties just simply don't have.
And it's reflected in the numbers. I mean, AFD numbers on TikTok completely dwarf rival German parties.
Yes, and this is nascent within Reform. I know that there are a number of Zoomers who are in and around the party itself. And I think what they need to do, they need to recognise the fact that they occupy a unique position within the British political landscape, which is they are a party that nominally reflects a type of politics that's typically associated with the older generations. And it is a kind of, it's the politics of patriotism and tradition and history and all this sort of thing, where the young are typically thought of as being liberal and opposed to those types of politics. A lot of young people are turning to Reform because they're viewing it as essentially being rock and roll. They're viewing it as being cool and sort of against the system and all this sort of thing.
A rebellion against the quite literally gay race communism that they're being taught in classrooms.
Exactly, yeah. And the interesting thing is, I may have made this point last time I was on, I don't remember, but a lot of young people are, a brilliant trick that our system plays is offering young people pre-packaged causes to get behind. I'm thinking of the Pride stuff, Just Stop Oil, BLM, all of these things that are, they present themselves as being radical and being rebellious kind of movements. But actually they're completely astroturfed, completely bought and paid for by, JP Morgan Chase. And
This is why Greta is now marching around in Kafia,
Yeah,
having abandoned the climate cause.
Yeah.
And if the Archbishop of Canterbury agrees with you, you're not some kind of insurgent radical.
Exactly, right? A lot of young people are waking up to this fact, right? This is why 1 in 10 under 30s voted for Reform in the election. They're recognizing that actually what it means to be, a little bit more kind of punk and sort of screw the system type thing is to be conservative, as lame as that sounds, but it is the case. And so what Reform need to do, and I think that this is ultimately the mission of the right in Europe in general, beyond parties, it's stretching out to organizations like the New Culture Forum and Lotus, for example, is to make right-wing politics cool. And Reform are extremely well positioned to do that because Farage is viewed as being cool by a lot of young people already. What they need to do is, again, recognise that their digital game is a hell of a lot stronger than anybody else's in the country and be prepared to engage with organisations who the mainstream regard as being, beyond the pale, but who ordinary people view as being completely sensible and actually speaking for their interests, like the NCF, for example, and Lotus.
Did you read Matt Goodwin's recent Substack that came out this morning?
Yes.
Point 2 in his friendly advice, given he spoke on the second day, as to what Reform should do is extend a hand of friendship to the Zoomers who may be their future candidates, if not present staffers, and free PR, because they're going to do it anyway. You may as well give them a cause to nail their colours to the mast on. My worry is, at the moment, there's a sort of air of mistrust because we do politics differently because we're digital natives.
Yeah.
And the older generation may not necessarily be so. Well,
this is the point. And, to properly answer your question, one of the key ways that they can engage and capture the kind of youthful energy that's already around the party is by establishing a youth wing. And obviously, as the audience knows, this is something that I've been working on. I've had a number of conversations with the leadership about this. And I think that they should do this sooner rather than later because, the energy is there now. But as we move further away from the general election and further into this kind of horrible, mundane political situation that we're staring down the barrel of, the excitement will fade. And so they have to maintain that energy. And I think that a youth wing that runs regular events and encourages people to get involved and shows young people that we are your political home. We will speak for you. We hear you. And we are prepared to represent your concerns at the national level. I think that's crucial. Moreover, it prevents the inevitable vacuum that is left without an official youth wing inevitably attracts the worst sorts of people who get interested in politics, which is people who are only in it for themselves, clear social climbers, and who ultimately don't have the best interests of the best interests of the party, much less the country, at heart. And that's something that Reform need to be prepared for, something they need to be vigilant for. And so I would say to them that, they need to get cracking with this.
Do you think that, I think we've got some local elections that are going to be coming out in about 9 months or so, a fair amount of time. How important do you think it is that Reform does well in those?
I think it's more about what local elections represent, because I think it is important that they do well. But ultimately, the really pressing issues are ones that can only be addressed at the national level. I'm talking about things like immigration and housing and so on. Local elections they're kind of, they're ultimately fought on potholes and bins, right? And that's a valid concern for people to have, those sorts of things. But when people vote at local elections, they typically vote on national issues.
They're a barometer of that as well.
Yeah, unless they are a particularly engaged sort of local person.
Which most people aren't these days.
Yeah, sure, yeah. They're going to be voting on the basis of national issues. And so I think that as a statement of power and domination, Reform should be putting resources into these local elections. And as I said, I'm helping out with my local branch. There's a by-election happening there right now that I'm helping out with. Because I think it is important that Reform do establish this national presence, because they have 5 MPs, but obviously those 5 MPs really are only at the local level. They're only relevant in the constituencies that they represent. Whereas if there was a Reform presence in every constituency on the council, suddenly you're dealing with quite a different political beast.
Also, if they can make it a pillar of their platform when running for local council elections to say, if appointed to your council, we will block any new migrant-specific development hotels.
Yeah.
The Labour Party have already said every area in the country is going to get its fair share of redistributed asylum seekers. If Reform can commit to being a stone in the shoe of the Labour Party's ambitions to conduct unprecedented demographic change in small towns across England, Wales, Scotland, and eventually Northern Ireland, then I think that would be a fantastic play for that.
And this is the point. If Reform are not going to be that, then what is their point?
Yes. I suppose they're in a difficult position at the moment because, on the one hand, they're, as Matt Goodwin put it to us in the pre-election show, Connor, they're a plane that is constructing itself in midair. So it's always going to give rise to complications. And there's a pressure on the one hand to professionalize, which sounds quite boring and quite dull and quite nuts and bolts. And there's a pressure on the other hand to keep things lively, to keep things vital, to keep things energetic. And it's always a difficult balance to strike. I would advise them in general that what they should be doing, still, given that they're still an insurgent party, is predominantly campaigning in poetry, and they can wait to govern in prose if they eventually end up winning. Thank you so much indeed, Charlie, for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Program. Connor, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.